So you want to compare the p-value to the alpha level and then write a conclusion statement. And this video applies to either a z or a t statistic, it doesn't matter. So you want to compare the p-value to the alpha level. If the p-value is less than the alpha level, then we reject the null and you find support for your research hypothesis. But if your p-value is greater than the alpha level, then you do not reject the null and you do not find new support for the research hypothesis. Now, you got to be careful when you don't reject the null. You don't want to just conclude that, oh, because we don't have support for the research hypothesis, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily false. It just means we don't have support for it. So it could mean that the research hypothesis is false in the population, and that's why we didn't find support for it. But it could also mean that we don't have enough power to reject the null and to find support for our research hypothesis. It could be, the reason could be is that the difference in the population is really small, so it's really hard to detect. Or it can mean that we didn't have a large enough sample size to find that difference, whether it be big or small. Could also mean that our measure for our outcome variable was not reliable. We didn't have a good enough measure, and if you have a bad measure that's not very exact, what's going to happen is we're going to have a bigger standard deviation, and that means you have a bigger standard error. And if you have a bigger standard error, our t statistic or z statistic will be smaller. But if we're more precise, we have a more reliable measure, then that means we're going to have a smaller standard deviation and a smaller standard error. And a smaller standard error means we're going to have a bigger t or z statistic. Because remember, the standard error is in the bottom of the the t or z formula. The standard error is in the bottom of the z or t formula. So a smaller denominator means a bigger t or z statistic. So just remember that if you don't find support for your research hypothesis, it doesn't necessarily mean that your research hypothesis is false. It just means you don't have enough evidence for it. Could mean that it's not real, it's not true, but it could also mean we just have to have better data to support it. So after you compare the p-value to your alpha level, then you need to write a sentence. Here is a basic sentence, the basic structure of the sentence, and I'll give you an example in a minute. So it says at the blank percent significance level. So if it was 0.05 was your alpha level, then you put 5%. So you take that proportion and put it in percentage form. If you had an alpha level of 0.10, you would put 10%. If it was 0.01, you put 1%. You just want to state your alpha level in the beginning. Then you say there is, or you say there is not. You say there is if you rejected the null and you found support for your research hypothesis, or if you fail to reject the null and do not find support for your research hypothesis, then you say there is not. So that's the key thing. That's the only way we know if you rejected the null or not, is that part. The rest of the sentence will be the same either way. So to say there is or there is not statistically significant evidence to conclude, then you write your research hypothesis in words. And I'll give you an example of that in just 1 second. So here's our example. So say our research hypothesis was that the average delivery times was actually greater than 30 minutes. We found a p-value of about 0.02. And say we set our alpha level at the most common level used in psychology, which is 0.05. So our p-value of 0.02 is less than our alpha level of 0.05. Thus, we reject the null and support the research hypothesis because our p-value is less than our alpha level. If our p-value is greater than our alpha level, we would not reject the null and we would not find support for our research hypothesis. So here's our sentence based on our findings. At the 5% significance level, there is, because we did reject the null, and we did find support for our research hypothesis because the p-value was less than our alpha level, we say there is statistically significant evidence to conclude that the average pizza delivery time is greater than 30 minutes. So basically, I'm just taking the research hypothesis and putting in words there. So we say the average, because we're talking about the population mean. Delivery times, because that was our outcome variable that we're talking about. You want to put that in there. And then you say is greater than, because we had a greater than symbol. And then the 30 minutes. And you want to put a units there. So the units for this example is in minutes. It's going to be different depending on the problem you do. But you want to say something about the average and describe what average you're talking about. Put greater than, less than, or not equal to. And then put the number and then the units for that number. Now, if you had a not equal to hypothesis here, then you probably want to write another sentence that says if it's greater than or less than. So you would say, if it was not equal to, then you would say something like the average pizza delivery time was not equal to 30 minutes. In fact, it was greater than 30 minutes if our research hypothesis was not equal to. So if it was not equal to, you would have to kind of write one sentence about it not being equal to 30 minutes, and then a follow-up sentence that says if it was greater than or less than. And if it was, if we found that there was not support for our research hypothesis, that we failed to reject the null, that our p-value is greater than our alpha level, then we would put is not here. Okay? Hopefully that's not too complicated. Just follow the basic formula for that sentence.